December 1944. The Ardennes forest lies buried under snow, a white labyrinth of trees and silence. Somewhere between the ghost villages of Lanzerath and Büllingen, German patrols move cautiously through the fog. Their boots crunch softly over ice. Their rifles glint under a pale moon. Then nothing. A rifle cracks once from nowhere. Another man drops. By dawn, entire patrols have vanished into the snow, their routes ending abruptly, their positions never radioed back. American officers whisper rumors of a sniper who could see at night. Some say he used captured German gear. Others insist he'd built something on his own, a trick so unorthodox it violated field regulations. Yet what he achieved would echo long after the Battle of the Bulge, because this man had done the impossible. He'd made himself invisible in the most dangerous forest of the war. By December 1944, the Western Front had gone quiet, or so the Allies thought. For 6 long months, American forces had been pushing through France after D-Day, exhausted but confident. They believed the German army was collapsing. The Ardennes region, thick with pine and snow, was considered a rest sector, a quiet place where fresh troops could recover before the final drive into the Reich. But on December 16, 1944, that illusion shattered. At dawn, the still forest erupted with artillery. The ground shook as thousands of German guns opened fire, unleashing the Wehrmacht's last desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Through the blizzard came waves of armor, the roar of panzer engines echoing off the trees. German infantry, including elite Waffen-SS units, surged forward under cover of fog and snow, smashing into unsuspecting American lines. The Allies were caught completely off guard. Units were scattered, roads blocked, and communication lines severed. The entire front dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance, small groups of men fighting in frozen forests, often surrounded, often at night. Night, that was the true enemy. The Ardennes winter turned darkness into something alive. The snow reflected every flicker of light, making even a cigarette ember visible from hundreds of yards away. American soldiers learned quickly. At night, light meant death. Patrols went out blind, guided only by sound and instinct. The Germans were experts in silent movement. Their scouts advanced like ghosts, knives in hand, muffled boots crunching softly under snow. For many Allied soldiers, survival meant lying still and waiting for dawn. In these conditions, the rifleman's most feared predator was the sniper. A single unseen marksman could paralyze entire units. But for the sniper himself, visibility was a cruel paradox. The scope that gave him precision by day became useless at night. The standard U.S. Army M1903A4 or M1C Garand sniper rifle had no night optics, no illumination. The sniper was as blind as the men he hunted. That blindness defined the Ardennes battles. German infiltration patrols moved freely under darkness, using the forest as their shield. Entire American outposts were wiped out before they even saw their attackers. Reports described machine gun nests found empty by morning, the snow stained dark and silent. And yet, among these shattered lines, one man refused to accept blindness as his fate. A veteran marksman hardened by months on the front began experimenting with light. He'd seen flares betray positions, seen tracers give away barrels, seen men die by the glow of their own cigarettes. But he also understood something simple. The human eye, if trained and aided correctly, could still fight the night. This was the world that shaped his decision, a world of frozen fear, improvised survival, and rules that could mean death if followed too rigidly. For officers, the battlefield was strategy. For soldiers, it was instinct. And in the black woods of the Ardennes, instinct often chose the forbidden path. By the winter of 1944, both sides understood that whoever controlled the night held a decisive edge. But in the Second World War, seeing in the dark was almost science fiction. The German army had taken the first real steps. In late 1944, elite units of the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front were issued an experimental system known as the ZG-1229 Vampire. It was a primitive infrared scope, mounted on the STG-44 assault rifle, a bulky box, with a battery pack and an invisible IR lamp. Under certain conditions, it allowed its user to see shapes and movement in near total darkness. But it was heavy, unreliable, and incredibly rare. Only a few hundred sets ever reached the front. And in the freezing chaos of the Ardennes, where logistics were collapsing and batteries froze solid overnight, such technology was little more than a rumor. The Allied forces, meanwhile, had their own limited experiments. American researchers had developed early sniper scopes, infrared sights powered by cumbersome packs, but they were still in testing stages, far from mass deployment. In December 1944, no U.S. sniper in Europe carried one. Instead, they fought the night with the simplest tool of all, light. Yet light was forbidden. In the field manuals and sniper schools, the rule was absolute. No flashlights, no torches, no reflective lenses, and never, ever shine light near a scope. A single beam, a single flicker could draw enemy fire faster than a shout. To be seen was to die. And so, the battlefield became a black ocean where men listened instead of looked, where snipers waited for footsteps, for breath, for the crunch of snow. But among the American ranks in the Ardennes, whispers spread of one shooter who was breaking that rule. He wasn't using flares or lamps. He wasn't even using the moon. He'd found a way to bounce or catch ambient light, perhaps the glow from distant artillery flashes, perhaps a trick with glass or mirror surfaces, and funnel it into his scope without revealing his position. It sounded impossible. And yet the bodies told another story. Patrols reported comrades vanishing without warning. German logs from January 1945 describe invisible fire along certain forest sectors, where night sentries fell with single shots. Some assumed it was luck, others a new Allied weapon. The truth was simpler and more daring. The sniper, whose name was never officially recorded in public archives, was applying an improvised method, using minimal reflected light, sometimes from the snow itself, to illuminate his sight picture just enough to target movement. It was delicate, dangerous work. If the angle was wrong, the reflection could reveal his lens. If too strong, it would blind him, yet it worked. The U.S. command would later describe the Ardennes as a laboratory of desperation. Soldiers on both sides learned to bend rules, to survive by invention. Mechanics turned wrecked tanks into static bunkers, medics used snow as bandages, and snipers, the loneliest of hunters, experimented in silence, their successes known only by what the enemy failed to see. Still, what this man did was not just improvisation. It was defiance. His commanding officer had forbidden the use of light altogether. Any device or reflection risked giving away a unit's position. But in the frozen woods, orders and survival often pointed in opposite directions. And so, this unnamed sniper, armed with an ordinary rifle, a field scope, and a quiet disregard for regulation, began rewriting the rules of night warfare on his own terms. He didn't know it then, but his small act of disobedience was a glimpse of the future, a world where soldiers would one day see in total darkness, where infrared and thermal vision would become standard. But in 1944, that future began in silence when, with one man, a rifle, and a faint reflection of light on snow. And to truly understand what made his act so remarkable, we must view it through several lenses: human, tactical, technological, and moral. Each reveals a different truth about what it meant to fight and to see in the dark. No name survives in the records. No citation, no photograph, only fragmented accounts from nearby units. A corporal who saw light flicker once, then nothing. An officer who found a scope smudged with soot. Whoever he was likely an ordinary infantry sniper, one of thousands trained after Normandy, assigned to a rifle company to provide overwatch during patrols. But in the Ardennes, ordinary men were pushed beyond the limits of discipline. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. Ammunition froze. Rifle oil turned to sludge. And in that frozen dark, the human mind began to twist. Night patrols blurred the line between courage and madness. Every sound was a potential ambush. The forest itself felt alive, branches cracking like rifles, the wind whispering through pine like distant German speech. Under such pressure, the sniper's craft became almost spiritual. To hunt unseen required not only skill but stillness, the kind that bordered on isolation. Many snipers spoke later of a strange calm, a meditative state between fear and control. For this man, that calm was survival. He could not afford hesitation. The Germans owned the night. Their patrols moved fluidly, trained to exploit confusion. To counter them, he needed to see. And so, while others waited for dawn, he began to experiment in silence, not as an engineer or scientist, but as a man trying to stay alive one more night. The Ardennes was not a battlefield. It was a maze. Dense fir trees blotted out the moon. Visibility dropped to less than 20 meters in some sectors. The snow muffled sound, creating a deceptive silence. Standard U.S. doctrine treated night operations defensively. Soldiers dug in and held their ground. Offensive patrols were limited, reconnaissance minimal. Illumination flares were reserved for emergencies only. Their brief light more often exposed Americans than Germans. German patrols exploited this passivity. They moved in small, disciplined groups, bypassing strong points, cutting telephone lines, and sowing panic behind Allied positions. Snipers were the one tool the Americans could deploy silently. But at night, their advantage vanished. Even moonlight couldn't pierce the black canopy. The sniper understood that light, though forbidden, could also be controlled. He studied how the snow reflected faint artillery flashes from miles away. He noticed that his scope, angled just right, could catch that reflection, a fleeting shimmer that revealed contrast against the trees. He began experimenting with small surfaces, the dull shine of a mess tin lid, the curved metal of his sight hood, even ice. By manipulating reflection, never a direct source, he could amplify available light by mere fractions, just enough to define shapes. It was primitive light management, but tactically revolutionary. While others fired blindly, he fired with intent. Reports from the sector showed German patrol losses concentrated around one sector of the line, at distances between 50 and 120 meters, close-range precision in total darkness. The results were unnerving. Patrols changed routes. German NCOs warned their men not to move through certain tree lines after midnight. Fear, not bullets, began to paralyze movement. The sniper had transformed the battlefield's greatest danger, darkness, into his greatest ally. World War II was on the edge of an optical revolution. The Germans had pioneered infrared scopes, but they were massive, power-hungry, and fragile. The U.S. military's first sniper scope prototypes were being tested in the Pacific, but were months from European deployment. The human eye, unaided, could detect movement under starlight, but not enough for accurate marksmanship. Every shot at night was guesswork, yet the sniper's method, his so-called forbidden trick, wasn't advanced technology. It was adaptation. He took advantage of the environment. Snow's natural albedo, the scattered glow from distant fires, even the phosphorescent glow of rotting wood. Combined, these created a faint, invisible layer of light across the forest floor. By darkening the rim of his scope with soot or mud, he reduced internal reflection, a technique some snipers learned instinctively to hide glint. Then, using a tiny improvised surface near his scope, perhaps a dull mirror shard fixed into the stock, he redirected whatever faint ambient light existed into the lens. To anyone watching, his position remained black, but through his sight outlines became visible, faint, ghostly enough to aim. It wasn't sanctioned and it wasn't safe. A single misaligned angle could flash light outward and expose his position. But the risk was balanced by knowledge. At night, even the Germans feared firing at nothing. This hybrid of instinct, science, and defiance effectively gave him night vision before night vision truly existed. The forest soon whispered of an invisible rifleman, a phantom who hunted in silence. German patrols began changing their hours. Americans spoke of strange, single-shot echoes in the dark. But the real story was not the myth. It was the method, and the mind behind it, that quietly altered how soldiers began to think about light, fear, and control in the dark. And it was only a matter of time before someone tried to stop him. Wartime ethics are written in ink, but survival is written in blood. Every soldier understood this contradiction. Orders existed to maintain structure. Disobedience, even for practical reasons, risked court-martial. But in the Ardennes, where command lines froze and radio nets died, obedience sometimes meant extinction. U.S. Army regulations were clear. No artificial illumination will be used near the forward line at night. That rule saved lives, usually. It prevented enemy snipers from targeting the faintest light sources. Yet the man who defied it knew another truth. Those same rules kept him blind. In military ethics, there's a fine line between genius and insubordination. A soldier who improvises and succeeds is called resourceful. A soldier who fails is reckless. The outcome decides the morality. By using light, even reflected indirect light, the sniper violated a principle drilled into him since training. But he also protected his men. Every German patrol he intercepted was one less threat creeping toward the line. One more morning his unit survived intact. There's no record of him being decorated, but there's also no record of him being punished. In that silence lies an unspoken understanding. Sometimes the battlefield forgives what the manual does not. His defiance became a quiet legend, not because it was authorized, but because it worked. It embodied a universal paradox of war, that innovation often begins where obedience ends. From the German side, the story took on a more sinister shape. Reports in Wehrmacht company logs and after-action notes from late December mention sniper fire of unknown origin near several Belgian villages, Lanzerath, Hansfeld, and Elsenborn Ridge. Patrols that moved at night vanished or returned shattered, claiming they'd been stalked by one shooter. At first, officers dismissed it as exhaustion or misidentification. The fog of war was thick, literally and psychologically. But patterns emerged. Each time, the same details surfaced. No muzzle flash, no sound but a single crack, and the body of the first man in the file dropping instantly. The Germans were trained to respect snipers. They had their own elite marksmen, often hunters or foresters in peacetime, but this was different. This American seemed to operate with unnatural precision, firing only once, then vanishing into silence. Some reports describe patrols firing wildly into trees, convinced they were surrounded. Others claimed to see flashes of reflection that disappeared before they could react. To the German soldier, the forest became haunted, not by ghosts, but by a man who could see when they could not. Night movement slowed. Patrol commanders refused to advance through certain zones without artillery illumination. Some units even requested to move only at dawn. Fear became its own weapon. A single rifleman had disrupted the rhythm of an entire sector. In that sense, his illegal method had achieved more than bullets ever could. It had paralyzed the enemy's initiative. The German war diaries that survived speak less of tactical losses and more of psychological paralysis. "The Americans are watching us in the dark," one sergeant wrote. "We move like blind men under their eyes." What began as one man's experiment had quietly shifted the balance of fear. Seeing in the dark is power, but power comes with a cost. Every sniper lived with isolation. He waited hours for a single shot, motionless in freezing air, his breath fogging inside his scope. Every kill was personal. There were no barrages, no noise to blur responsibility. The man in the Ardennes carried that burden alone. To kill by day was war. To kill by night was something else. Intimate, almost unnatural. It demanded not only skill but emotional detachment. The human brain resists targeting what it cannot see clearly. He had to train himself to shoot at movement, at suggestion, at a whisper of shadow. Psychologists who later studied sniper behavior in WO noted an unnerving pattern. Night shooters often developed auditory memory. They remembered sounds more vividly than images. The crunch of snow before a shot. The way silence seemed to grow heavier after it. He likely never spoke of what he did. Most snipers didn't. Their work existed in the gray zone between necessity and taboo. But the mental toll was unmistakable. Each success reinforced his isolation. Each kill deepened his distance from the men he protected. They celebrated the quiet nights he provided, unaware of the cost. To see in the dark is to separate yourself from those who can't. And when the war finally moved east, and the front lines shifted, he left no trace. His weapon likely turned in, his technique forgotten by official history, yet whispered among marksmen for years after. He'd proven something profound, that darkness itself could be learned, understood, even mastered. But mastery of darkness often leaves its mark. In the war's final winter, his actions blurred every line, between courage and defiance, between discipline and instinct, between light and dark. And then came one night when all those lines collapsed at once. when the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, and his forbidden trick would be pushed to its limit. The forest was silent again, too silent. By early January, the Battle of the Bulge had entered its final phase. The German advance had stalled. Their fuel was running out, but in the woods around Elsenborn Ridge, small patrols still clashed in the dark. Both sides hunted for advantage. The snow lay deep, untouched but for a few winding tracks. The moon hung low, filtered through thin fog. Somewhere between the tree lines, one American sniper waited, his rifle resting over a log wrapped in rags to muffle its metal. He'd been awake for nearly 2 days. His unit had intercepted reports of German scouts probing the line again, the same group that had slipped through twice before. If they succeeded tonight, they'd flank an entire company position before dawn. He could hear them before he saw them. Low voices, boots crunching in rhythm, the click of metal on a rifle sling. 5 men, maybe 6, moving cautiously, rifles raised. The sound carried differently in the snow, softer, deceptive. The sniper's eyes scanned the dark. Nothing but shadow. He'd memorized every branch, every mound, every trunk within 100 yards. And now something was different. A new shape faint, breaking the uniformity of the trees. He reached slowly into his pocket, withdrew a small metal disc, a piece of ration tin he'd been polishing smooth for weeks. He set it beside his scope, angled it just so, catching the faintest glint of moonlight on snow. For a heartbeat, the image inside the scope changed. The black void bloomed with contrast, faint whites and grays. The trunks reappeared. The contours of helmets emerged like ghosts. He could see. The lead German crouched, scanning with binoculars. The sniper's fingers steadied on the trigger, waiting for the right breath, the moment between motion and stillness. He exhaled, the frost leaving his lips like smoke. Then the rifle cracked. One sound, sharp and final. The echo vanished into the trees. The German patrol froze. No muzzle flash, no direction. The man with binoculars fell sideways into the snow. Panic spread instantly. The rest scattered behind trunks, firing blindly into darkness. Bullets tore through branches above him, sending down bursts of snow. The sniper didn't move. He waited, listening, counting the seconds. One soldier broke cover, sprinting toward the left flank. Another reflection, another whisper of light, another shot, silence again. The survivors began shouting, not to attack but to retreat. They dragged their wounded through the snow, leaving streaks behind them. Within minutes, the forest was still. When American patrols moved out at dawn, they found only footprints and 2 bodies. One officer, one scout, no trace of who had killed them, but the pattern was unmistakable. German infiltration in that sector stopped completely for the next 10 days. Commanders noticed the sudden calm and assumed the enemy had shifted focus. Only a handful of men knew why. In his report, the sniper wrote only one line: observed movement, engaged, visibility fair, nothing more. No mention of the trick, no detail of the reflection. He knew better. His light experiment violated standing orders. A single mention could have meant reprimand, so he left the truth between himself and the forest. That night marked the turning point. The Germans never returned to that route. American positions stabilized, and across the lines, whispers began spreading, of a man who could see without flares, who hunted shadows like they were daylight. But for the sniper himself, the success came with a quiet unease. He had proven his method worked, but at what cost? Each kill was a confirmation that he had crossed a line no one else dared to approach. The forest, once his enemy, had become his accomplice. The snow his light source, and darkness his ally. But as the front shifted and the Germans began their retreat, his secret would not stay hidden. His superiors wanted to know how he'd achieved what others couldn't, and that question would expose everything he had tried to conceal. At first, no one questioned it. The following mornings in early January brought an eerie calm. German infiltration patrols stopped completely. Listening posts reported less movement, fewer firefights. The company finally slept through the night without alarms. It seemed the enemy had simply vanished. But in war, disappearance always leaves traces. 2 days after that engagement, a lieutenant from the battalion intelligence section arrived to inspect the forward positions. He carried with him a clipboard, a flask of coffee, and curiosity. The reports from this small sector didn't make sense. Too many successful night defenses. Too few casualties. When he found the sniper's hide, he noticed the strange setup immediately. The rifle's scope rim darkened with soot, a piece of ration tin wired loosely to the stock, its edge polished bright. To the lieutenant it looked like field clutter, but to anyone with experience behind a scope it was something far more deliberate. "What's this for?" he asked. The sniper hesitated, then answered simply, "For seeing." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You mean reflecting light?" The silence that followed said enough. He wrote a note in his report but didn't press further. Officially, it was a minor modification to field equipment. Unofficially, it was a breach of orders, one that had saved the entire line. When the report reached headquarters, opinions split sharply. Some officers praised the ingenuity. Others saw it as reckless endangerment, a trick that could have exposed not only the sniper but the whole platoon to enemy fire. In any other battle, that argument might have mattered. But in the Ardennes, logic bent under pressure. The front was collapsing in places. Units were fighting without supplies, without sleep. Innovation, even the kind born from disobedience, had become a lifeline. The controversy never reached beyond the battalion. It was buried under larger concerns: resupply, casualties, the coming counterattack. Still, among the men who knew, the story grew. They began calling him Ghost Eye. It wasn't meant as flattery. It was half admiration, half unease, because there was something unnatural about what he did. Soldiers respected him, but few spoke to him. His ability to see had separated him not just from the enemy, but from his own comrades. He remained silent about his method, cleaning his rifle in isolation, speaking only when ordered. To him, secrecy wasn't pride, it was survival. The war had taught him one truth: anything that gives you power in darkness also makes you a target in daylight. When the snow began to melt in late January and the German retreat became irreversible, investigators combed through field records for data: ammunition use, engagement outcomes, night activity. The sniper's pattern stood out: high kill counts, minimal expenditure, near total accuracy. His CO was asked to provide an account. The commanding officer's statement was simple: he did what he had to do. The men are alive because of it. That one line closed the case. There would be no reprimand, no commendation, no official recognition. The event simply disappeared into paperwork, lost between reports of larger battles. But those who'd served nearby didn't forget. In mess tents and field hospitals, the tale circulated like a rumor from another war. Some claimed he'd used broken glass. Others said he'd stolen a German infrared sight. None of it was true, but the myth grew stronger than the fact. The army had little room for myths then. Its gaze was fixed eastward toward the Rhine and beyond. Yet something shifted quietly in military thought. In February 1945, engineers from the U.S. Army Signal Corps resumed field trials of an experimental infrared sniper scope, the M1 snooper scope. For the first time, they began documenting the tactical possibilities of limited illumination. Perhaps they never heard of the Ardennes sniper. Perhaps someone somewhere mentioned him in passing. But history often moves in silence, ideas spreading not by orders but by whispers. When the battle ended, the sniper's unit pulled back for rest and reorganization. Many men received medals. He didn't. There was nothing to award, no witnesses, no official recognition. His trick remained undocumented, unacknowledged. He left behind no photograph, no name in the record. Only a discolored patch of snow where his last position had been, and the rumor that somewhere in the Ardennes, an American had bent light itself to his will. The forest, once alive with battle, grew silent again. The snow melted. The roads cleared. By March, only birds and wreckage remained. But deep in that forest, where moonlight had once bounced off a tin disc and changed the course of a patrol, the echo of his defiance lingered. It wasn't invention in the scientific sense. It was something older, human adaptation at its rawest. A moment when instinct overtook regulation, when survival demanded vision that technology hadn't yet caught up to provide. He had proven that night didn't belong to one side alone. He had shown that in war, rules protect the many, but innovation often saves the few. And as the front lines pushed east toward Germany, his idea that light could be controlled, not feared, began to shape the next generation of warfare. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the world called it victory. But for those who'd fought there, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like awakening. The Battle of the Bulge had tested everything: endurance, supply lines, leadership, and faith in conventional warfare. It was the last time the U.S. Army fought blind at night, relying only on flares, moonlight, and instinct. And somewhere deep in that forest, one man's unrecorded act had revealed a truth the Army could no longer ignore. That visibility itself was a weapon. After the winter thaw, investigators from the U.S. Signal Corps and Army Ordnance Department returned to Europe to analyze battlefield equipment. Their focus was primarily on captured German technology, from infrared Zielgerät scopes to Uhu-mounted IR searchlights used by Panzer Grenadier units. But scattered testimonies from frontline units hinted at something else. Isolated soldiers improvising low-light shooting, techniques long before the technology was ready. Reports mentioned reflected light aiming, contrast masking, and light traps, small field tricks designed to manipulate how light moved across snow or metal. The concept was primitive, even dangerous, but the principle was revolutionary. The idea that night could be engineered. For decades, war had obeyed the same rhythm: fight by day, dig in by night. The Ardennes shattered that. What began as a desperate defense in darkness had become a laboratory for the future. By mid-1945, as American units advanced into Germany, the Signal Corps accelerated testing of the M1 snooper scope and its improved version, the M3 carbine IR sight. These devices, using active infrared illumination, allowed soldiers to detect and engage targets in total darkness up to 70 yards away. It wasn't perfect. The systems were bulky, power-hungry, and fragile, but the concept had crossed the threshold from myth to method. In several post-war debriefs, U.S. engineers referenced improvised light control tactics observed during the Ardennes and Rhine crossings. They didn't name individuals, but the pattern was clear. Field experience had outpaced laboratory design. Soldiers had learned to see before scientists had learned to build. This shift marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. By 1946, engineers at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, were tasked with improving infrared targeting for small arms. Their internal reports noted increased soldier adaptability to light management, a bureaucratic phrase describing the same instinct that one anonymous sniper had demonstrated in Belgium. War had always driven invention, but rarely did invention begin at the rifleman's eye level. The sniper's field improvisation, though uncredited, had proved one thing to the Army's research divisions: human ingenuity in combat was often ahead of doctrine. By 1947, experimental IR systems had been miniaturized and standardized for field testing in Japan during the Korean occupation. Less than 5 years after the Ardennes, U.S. night vision devices were no longer fantasy. They were doctrine. The men who'd survived the Bulge returned home changed. They spoke little of heroism and even less of glory. Many remembered the forest only as a place where light vanished, where you couldn't tell friend from foe until it was too late. For the sniper, if he lived to see peace, his silence likely continued. There was no record of his name, no citation, no recognition. Only a handful of oral accounts from infantrymen who remembered a guy who could shoot in the dark. He faded into history just as quietly as he'd appeared, absorbed by the very shadows he'd mastered. Yet, his effect lingered like an echo. When post-war instructors began teaching night firing techniques at infantry schools, much of what they emphasized, light discipline, muzzle flash masking, reflective control, came from lessons learned, not from manuals. Somewhere in those lessons, his ghost remained. As the world rebuilt itself from the ruins of 1945, the age of night warfare had already begun, not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in a frozen forest where one soldier had turned darkness into his ally. And what followed would reshape not just weapons, but the psychology of seeing itself. By 1949, the world had split in two. The victory over fascism had given way to the quiet tension of the Cold War, and once again night became a battlefield. But this time it wasn't fought in the forests of Belgium. It stretched across radar screens, submarine decks, and border patrols under perpetual darkness. Every major power wanted the same thing: to see first. In the United States, engineers at Fort Belvoir and RCA laboratories pushed the limits of infrared imaging. Their early work on sniper scopes evolved into the first generation of passive image intensifiers, devices that no longer relied on projecting infrared light, but instead amplified ambient starlight. It was a revolution born from the same principle that a lone sniper had discovered in the Ardennes. That light, no matter how faint, could be captured, controlled, and weaponized. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union was conducting similar experiments. Captured German scientists, once responsible for the Zielgerät 1229 Vampire project, were now working under Soviet supervision, refining portable night vision for sentries and tank crews. The competition was no longer just about firepower or armor. It was about perception itself, and though no official history would ever mention that forgotten American sniper, the philosophy of his act, adapting human senses to technology, not waiting for permission, had become doctrine. As night vision spread through armies, it changed more than tactics. It changed the way soldiers thought about fear, distance, and time. Before, night had been a wall, a curtain that ended combat and offered temporary reprieve. After the war, that wall crumbled. Darkness no longer meant safety. It became an extension of the battlefield. Infantry training manuals of the 1950s began including detailed sections on light discipline, contrast detection, and reflected light camouflage. Soldiers were now taught to treat every glimmer, every shadow, as potential information, an enemy's mistake or their own. For the first time, vision itself became a weapon category. The snooper scope and its successors, ANPVS-1, ANPVS-2, turned the lessons of the Ardennes into institutional knowledge. They were heavy, awkward, and sometimes unreliable, but they worked. The battlefield no longer slept. No medals were awarded for discovering how to see in the dark. No battlefield reports credited the experiment that started it. But the legacy survived through behavior, in the reflexes of soldiers, in the procedures of engineers, and in the doctrine of entire armies. Somewhere, deep in classified training files, there are likely notes, brief references to field-adapted low-light methods observed 1944-45. It's not proof of authorship, but it's evidence of evolution. And perhaps that's how real innovation in war survives, not through recognition, but through absorption. The sniper's act was never meant to rewrite history. It was an act of survival born from desperation. Yet by doing so, he unknowingly pointed the world toward a new age, one where man and machine would merge in the pursuit of sight. By the 1960s, the human eye was no longer the limit of warfare. Helicopter pilots in Vietnam used starlight scopes to spot enemy movement under jungle canopies. Navy lookouts tracked ships by infrared wake. The ghost of that Ardennes trick, of reflected light turned advantage, lived on in every green glow on a screen. But something was lost too. The fear of the dark, once universal among soldiers, had been replaced by a new fear, that nothing was unseen anymore. War had become permanent observation. In a strange way, the sniper's success had ended the night's neutrality. The same ingenuity that saved a squad in Belgium now defined an era where even shadows could no longer hide. By the time satellites and thermal imagers entered the battlefield, the transformation was complete. The age of natural darkness was over, yet deep beneath that technological triumph lies a quiet human truth, that before there were machines to see in the dark, there was a man who refused to be blind. The forest, long melted and silent, remains his monument, invisible, unmarked, but eternal in the way light bends through branches on a winter night. And from that forgotten glimmer in the snow, the modern battlefield was born. History rarely remembers the quiet innovators. It celebrates victories, generals, and machines, but not the soldier alone in the dark, whose only invention was necessity. In the winter of 1944, one sniper in the Ardennes proved that vision is not just a sense, it is a will. When rules failed, when equipment froze, and when doctrine offered no answers, he created one from instinct. He didn't invent night vision, he became it. That act, small, unauthorized, and almost forgotten, marked a turning point in how humanity fought its wars. It was the moment when darkness stopped being a boundary and became a battlefield. Every generation since has inherited that idea. From infrared goggles to thermal satellites, from drones that see through clouds to sensors that read heat beneath the earth, all of it began with the same question whispered in a frozen forest. How can I see when I'm not supposed to? It's a question older than war itself, the question of survival. In every age, soldiers adapt faster than their orders, and the battlefield evolves through their defiance. The Ardennes sniper wasn't rebelling against command. He was rebelling against blindness, against the limits that nature and fear imposed. And in doing so, he revealed something about the human spirit, that even in the coldest silence, surrounded by death and darkness, man will find a way to bring light. His name is lost, his method forgotten by paperwork, but his lesson endures, not in museums or medals, but in every beam of night vision green that cuts through modern war. Because every time a soldier lifts a scope and sees the unseen, somewhere, across the decades, that man in the snow is still there, steady, silent, seeing.